Last night, U.S. President Biden held a marathon 2-hour press conference at the White House to mark his first year in office. He said what was uncomfortable and obvious. NATO is not always unified over what to do about Russia. And he threw confusion on top of that by suggesting the U.S. and its allies might react differently to a minor incursion into Ukraine by Russia as opposed to a full-scale military invasion. His press secretary has spent the past 24 hours explaining what her boss meant to say. And on this side of the Atlantic, it was cleanup duty as well for U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. On a stop here in Berlin today, he once again reassured Kyiv and U.S. allies in Europe that the U.S. stance remains unchanged. Any Russian move against Ukraine will result in severe consequences. Period.
The stakes are high. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken landing in Berlin to try and rally America's allies and prevent a war. Unity is the main goal here. Blinken and his German, French and British counterparts discuss the intense fears that Russia may soon invade Ukraine. Their focus, how to credibly deter Moscow, with warnings of what could follow.
Even as we're relentless in pursuing this diplomatic path, we'll continue to make very clear that if Moscow chooses the path of further aggression, we will impose swift and massive costs.
We urgently call on Russia to take steps towards de-escalation. Any further aggression would have serious consequences.
But comments by the US president a day earlier have raised questions about whether those consequences really do apply to any act of aggression.
Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, etc. But if they actually do what they're capable of doing with the force amassed on the border, it is going to be a disaster for Russia.
The White House later tried to clarify, insisting that the West would react, come what may. But the issue has highlighted questions over what level of aggression would trigger what kind of response. The US has made it clear that it would expect Berlin to target the controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which links Germany to Russian gas.
It's also worth noting that gas is not flowing through Nord Stream 2 yet, which means that the pipeline is leverage for Germany, the United States and our allies, not Russia.
For now, though, there's another round of diplomacy coming up. Antony Blinken will meet his Russian counterpart in Geneva on Friday, seen as one of the last chances to find a way of avoiding war.
Well, we have team coverage of this story tonight. Our Washington bureau chief, Ines Pohl, she joins us from the U.S., and our chief international correspondent, Richard Walker, he is here with us in Berlin. To both of you, good evening. Let me start with you, Richard. When it comes to dealing with Russia in Ukraine, just how unified is the West?
Well, there's been a pretty strong show of unity from the Western allies during this crisis so far, Brent, even to the extent that there was evidence of some exasperation by the Russian side last week during the sort of first intense round of diplomacy that began last week, where first of all they met the Americans, then they met all of the NATO member states, then they met the members of the wider Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, last week. There was sort of exasperation at the sort of unity of the message that was being played back at them, to the extent that by the end of last week, the Russians were almost saying, well, we're not sure if we want to keep talking at all. But this unity will certainly get tested in the weeks ahead, particularly if the Russians do move ahead with some further aggression against Ukraine. And on a couple of questions, as we just heard in the piece there, what degree of aggression leads to what degree of reaction, the kind of thing that Biden was raising in those comments that caused such an outcry. That is a genuine question, especially here in Germany for the Social Democrat Party, which has always been trying to keep close connections with Russia, plus how to respond to the bigger Russian demand of a total rethink of the sort of European security order. There, the French president yesterday seemed to be going off on his own track. So we'll have to see how far that unity does hold.
And Ines, we heard the president last night throwing some doubts on allied unity. I mean, just how satisfied is Washington with the position of its European allies?
President Biden is really in a tough spot right here, Brent. On the one side, domestic political pressure builds up. Both parties have indicated that they have very different approaches when it comes to Russia. And on the other side, there's Europe and Germany with very mixed messages, at least in the beginning of the crisis at the Ukrainian border. However, as Richard just pointed out, I do think that over the course of the last days, the message from Germany is a little bit clearer, actually also within Germany. If Putin really invades Ukraine, he will face harsh sanctions.
And last night, Biden was asked about Ukraine's geography, the fact that it borders NATO members, as well as Russia, and how that should be included in any calculus in the Kremlin regarding an invasion. Take a listen to what he said.
The only war that's worse than one that's intended is one that's unintended. And what I'm concerned about is this could get out of hand, very easily get out of hand because of what you said, the borders of Ukraine and what Russia may or may not do. I am hoping that Vladimir Putin understands that he is short of a full-blown nuclear war. He's not in a very good position to dominate the world.
To dominate the world. But let's look at the facts here, Richard. We've got 100,000 Russian troops positioned on the border with Ukraine. We had Ukraine's president last night telling his country to exhale and to turn down the level of worry. I mean, how concerned is the West of a war breaking out by accident?
Yeah, well, there are two things we're talking about here, of course. We're talking about the potential invasion by the Russians of Ukraine. And then what Biden is referring to there, this fear of accidental war, that this could potentially spill over to a wider conflict with NATO. And, I mean, these concerns are real. Ukraine has borders with 4 NATO countries. Belarus, which may get drawn into this conflict, Putin has been sending Russian troops there too, that has borders to 2 more NATO countries. All of those NATO countries are going to feel extremely vulnerable if a conflict does break out. They're going to be wanting reinforcements to come in from NATO. So you're likely to see a sort of a pile-in of troops into the region from the NATO side. And this does raise, of course, the prospect of some potential clashes down the road, whether they're intended at this point or not. So genuine fears there, yeah.
And, Ines, to take it to you, even if Joe Biden had hawkish hands, which we know he doesn't, they would be tied because Americans are simply tired of foreign wars. There is no willingness to go to war over Ukraine, is there?
No, not at all, Brendan. I'm traveling the country quite a bit, and I also try to talk a little bit politics with the people when I talk, when I report on other topics. And no, there's definitely no will to start a new war, to get involved with Russia even. We have to keep in mind the Cold War is long over and people's memories are short. People are much more concerned about China these days than about Russia. And quite frankly, if you would ask an average American where Ukraine or Belarus or other countries would be on the map, they wouldn't even be able to show you where they lie.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ines. We're talking about a superpower that is overstretched abroad and underinvested at home. That is the United States that Joe Biden says he inherited from Donald Trump. Biden has now been in office exactly 1 year as of today. I'd like us to put together a first-year report card for President Biden tonight, and we're going to start by taking a look back at what he did in his first year and, most importantly, how he did what he did.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
1 year ago, large parts of the Western world breathed a sigh of relief. Not so much because of the new occupant of the White House, President Joe Biden, a long-term figure in Washington with almost a half a century of policy-making experience, but because they hoped that the chaotic chapter that was the Donald Trump experiment would soon be at an end. David Marinis is an award-winning journalist and a presidential biographer.
He was clearly the right person for the job a year ago. He was probably the one Democrat who could get elected and stop the Trump descendants. But now, a year later, there are real questions about that, about whether he's the right person for the next 3 years.
To start with the positives. In his first year in office, President Biden was able to push a $1 trillion infrastructure package through Congress, a feat that no president had been able to accomplish in 60 years. But its impact won't be felt for a long time, and people might not reward him with their vote in 2024. What they do feel immediately are the increasing prices for basic goods. Inflation has risen at its fastest pace in nearly 4 decades, pushing prices up at a 7% annual rate. For the international community, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan raised many questions, especially about how closely the new White House is really willing to work together with its NATO partners.
1, 2, 3.
Like most parts of the world, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic is a major challenge. With midterm elections coming up in November, Biden is in danger of losing his razor-thin majority in the Senate and in the House. Biden has to walk a fine line between protecting the American people and scaring or ignoring the concerns of possible voters.
Mr. President.
With his approval rating at an all-time low, with 65% of Americans believing his presidency is a failure, what could the next steps be?
It requires more than just Joe Biden. It requires the entire Democratic Party to get its act together, which it hasn't been able to do in this last year. And getting some luck on the pandemic. I mean, some of it is beyond his control.
Even one of the most powerful politicians in the world faces severe limits to pushing through his agenda.
And Ines, you know, most U.S. presidents in their first year, if they are lucky, they are able to get one piece of major legislation through Congress in their first year. Joe Biden, he got 2. I mean, you said it, the COVID rescue plan, the infrastructure bill. Why isn't he bragging about these accomplishments? And why aren't his fellow Democrats in Congress, why aren't they bragging about this as well?
Well, the problem is, Brent, as we just heard in the piece, it will take years probably before people really feel the outcome of the infrastructure package. I'm sure that the history books will write about that in 10, 20, 30 years, but for now, people don't feel that. That is a problem, and it is also a problem with COVID-19. I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden did do many things right in the beginning. He probably failed on putting out enough testing kits to the people, but he provided a country with the possibility to get vaccinated without any preparation, because President Donald Trump didn't leave any plan. However, this is nothing people will remember, but what they feel is the inflation rate. And they also see kind of the internal fights of the Democratic Party. And this is everything, or all that is, Joe Biden is blamed for that. Maybe unfortunately so.
Yeah, and we want to be fair here. I mean, Biden is faced with a Republican Party that has obedience to Donald Trump on its mind, not compromise with the Democrats on its mind. I want you to take a listen to what Biden said about the GOP last night.
I did not anticipate that there'd be such a stalwart effort to make sure that the most important thing was that President Biden didn't get anything done. Think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for.
You know, Richard, Joe Biden there, he sounds as if he didn't reckon with Republican blockades. While you, I, Ines, the rest of the world, we reckoned with that. Biden came to the White House with the most experience, more experience under his belt than any president in modern history. How do you explain this apparent naivete regarding the Republicans?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's naivety, really, Brent. I think he just has to say that. He sees no alternative. The alternative would be simply to say, to sort of suggest that he himself is to blame for these failures. And, of course, I mean, we all remember, you know, he's had a very long career, but, of course, you know, the last big ticket on his career was being vice president to Barack Obama. And the last couple of years of that, at the very least, were totally hobbled by Republican obstructionism. So Of course, he would have expected this to happen, but I think at the moment he's so under fire that, of course, this is pretty much the explanation he has to offer.
And Ines, as frustrating as it is, I mean, you deal with this a lot traveling across the United States. What do everyday Americans, what do they tell you when you ask about Biden's inability to break through the political paralysis in Washington?
I think a lot of Americans are discouraged about American politics overall. I mean, depending where people sit politically, some certainly will blame the president for the lack of movement and how Congress has stalled almost every piece of legislation. And people who sit on the left are definitely disappointed because they believed that they had a moment to make history by passing social policy and voting rights. But obviously, many really underestimated the divide in the party in the Democratic Party between moderates and progressives, and that the razor-thin majority was way more significant than they believed. One thing, Brent, I always experience, and that is, I think, really worrisome, is that more and more people really turn their back towards politics. They don't care anymore. They're not interested anymore. They're so tired of that. And I think this really is a huge threat for this democracy here.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a big threat to democracies everywhere. Let's broaden the scope of Biden's first year in office and place it in a global context. I want you to listen to what he said last night regarding the 21st century struggle between democracies and autocracies.
Unless you can reach consensus in a democracy, you cannot sustain the democracy. And so this is a real test, whether or not my counterpart in China is right or not when he says autocracies are the only thing that are going to prevail because democracies take too long to make decisions and countries are too divided. I believe we're going through one of those inflection points in history.
Inflection points in history. Ines, President Biden sounds like a man who may harbor secret doubts about democracy winning the day and the century against the forces of China, Russia, and company. Do you agree?
Well, for Biden, I think we always have to imagine only days before he took office, thousands of Trump supporters really scaled the walls of Congress because they believed the election was stolen. And the former president attempted essentially a political coup to stay in office. And this is something I think Joe Biden is still kind of shaped by, and he's still shaken by. So he won't forget that. And I think that he fears that the institutions that once held the United States as the so-called beacon of democracy are not a certain ground anymore. So he definitely is watching his own country struggling to keep a democracy upright, and there are many signs which lead in that direction. So yes, indeed, I think he is not betting on the future of democracy in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's really sad. It's certainly not encouraging. Richard, let's talk more about this inflection point in history. I mean, it implies a process that's not complete. We are perhaps in the middle of it. We don't know how it will look on the other side. Talk to me a little bit about the position of Biden's America in this inflection.
Yeah, well, it is funny, Brent, isn't it? I would agree with everything Ines said just there. And Biden was talking about this inflection point. He raised it a couple of times in speeches last year as well, and at some length in his press conference last night too. And it was quite interesting. Some of this really overlaps with what Xi Jinping was saying earlier in the week to the World Economic Forum, saying that this is a period where the world is undergoing very, very intense change. And I think there is where Biden and Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, would absolutely agree. But I think from the US perspective, the greatest danger certainly is internal, that you have in the US a political system that is really struggling to deal with these kind of twin challenges from society on the one hand and from technology on the other hand, which are fueling this incredible partisanship, this incredibly adversarial politics, where you have a political system in the United States that is simply not built for that, which actually demands consensus because of the extensive number of checks and balances built into the system. And yeah, I think it is a genuine concern for the United States that the democracy might kind of eat itself and buckle under the systemic problems facing up to these technological and societal problems. And that would be, obviously, it's a very, very damaging signal to the rest of the democratic world and also to countries that where democracy has yet to take hold and flourish.
Richard, what would a Donald Trump as the GOP presidential candidate in 2024, what would that mean for, this inflection point in history?
Well, I mean, of course, Donald Trump is a figure who very eagerly stokes this adversarial politics, stokes this kind of divisive politics. But I think there's almost a paradox at the moment that we've seen under Joe Biden, who's somebody who really doesn't try to do that. I mean, he essentially is seen as a figure who tries to unite. But even under him, this has not been quelled. That what we're looking at here are potentially changes in American society and politics that are structural and don't depend necessarily so much on the individual at the top.
All right, so finally, for both of you, let's issue this presidential report card for Joe Biden. Enos, you first. On a scale, we're doing it the American way, from an A+ to an F. What grade do you give the president?
Well, how do we grade the president? Is it kind of on a sliding scale? Did the president pass two major pieces of legislation that has major effect on the United States? Yes. Mm-hmm. But has he been able to move any of his domestic agenda? No. So it is really, really difficult. I would give him an A because he beat Donald Trump and he won the White House, but I would give him a boring C, 1 year in office.
Okay, so all right, we'll take the average of that and give him a B. Then from you, Enos. And Richard, what grade would you say Biden has earned?
Well, I'm just going to duck that completely, Brent.
Come on.
What I am going to say that from the international point of view, I mean, certainly around the Western democracies, there really was this kind of sigh of relief when Biden won office last year. A year on, there's definitely worry about the direction that the United States is headed in. And I think I would say one thing: if I was a Democratic Party strategist at the moment, I would really be hoping that Biden doesn't stand next time around. I would be hoping that it is time for a transition, a generational transition in the Democratic Party. At the moment, it looks like a gerontocracy with Biden, Pelosi and Schumer. Pelosi's on the way out already. I think if I was a Democrat, I would be saying to Biden, make way for the next generation. It's time.
But he said last night that he would be running in 2024 with Kamala Harris as his VP running mate. We will see if he's able to keep his word on that. To both of you, thank you. Let's do this again in 1 year's time. We will have the midterm elections to get through and talk about in the meantime. Enos Pohl, Richard Walker, both of you, thank you.